So, welcome to our first Twitter Spaces at the University of Manchester. We're joined by Professor of Public History at the University, David Olusoga. David is a writer, broadcaster, presenter and filmmaker, so keep yourself pretty busy. You may have seen him on BBC Two's A House Through Time, or even watched his bedtime stories last night on CBeebies, if that's more your thing. David read Baroness Floella Benjamin's Coming to England last night. So welcome, David. Is it good to be back on campus? I know it's been a long time. It's not a particularly nice day for it, is it?
It's lovely, not just to be back on campus, but to see the campus full. And that I think, I haven't seen crowds anywhere. I've been very busy and I've taken lockdown very seriously. It seemed to me that historians had no key worker status and didn't need to be out on the streets. So I really haven't been out very much. And it's remarkable. I haven't been to a university campus, of any university campus, even in Bristol where I live, for 2 years, really, well, since March last year. So it's amazing to see Manchester campus bustling and very, very like normal.
And obviously you're here because you're hosting a Black History Month panel later today. That's in person, but we're also live streaming it on Facebook later on. So I think our first question is, how important is Black History Month? And in your opinion, what impact has it had?
Well, I think one of the odd things that we don't do in Black History Month is celebrate Black History Month. And I think if you take a step back and look at it, you realise it's an amazing achievement. It's one of the great achievements of the Black British community. It's only 34 years old. When I was a kid, Black history just didn't exist. It was never a phrase I heard. In 1987, it's brought to Britain in a small way. Since then, over those 34 years, it's grown and expanded. It's become part of the calendar of thousands and thousands of British companies and corporations, schools and universities and charities. And this is 3.3% of the population whose history has been systematically airbrushed out of the British story for centuries. A history that just barely existed in archival terms just 50, 60, 70 years ago. Almost nothing was known. Or most of the black figures that we know today and think of as Black Britons from the past were unknown. They were lost in the archive. This great work of archival salvage is what Black British history is, and then the work of propagating it and explaining it and bringing it to the public, the white public as well as the black public. That's what Black History Month has done. It's taken this incredible act of historical salvage and made it public, made it part of the national calendar, and it's done it in 34 years. And I think the people who began Black History Month in London in 1987 would not have been able to believe what it's grown to become today. So I think it is an amazing achievement. We've taken this American idea, this American import, and made it part of our national calendar.
Great, and obviously as part of that today, you're hosting an event at the university. It's called From Bristol to Manchester, History and Memory in Our Cities. So we'll be live streaming that on Facebook later, so if you're happy, just let people know who is participating and what topics you're going to touch on with your guests in the event.
Well, we have a panel that's made up of people from those two cities, from Bristol and Manchester. Bristol, of course, was the city that last June was thrust into the centre of these debates about statues, memorials, about history, and about contested history. And Manchester has been, like lots of cities, carrying out an audit, as it were, of its statues. One of the things I think we learned last summer is that we actually didn't know as a country who we had memorialised in marble and in bronze, who those people were, never mind what they did. And so Manchester, like many cities, is engaged in this process of looking at who is remembered, looking at who's not remembered, and thinking about, is this appropriate? Do we want to make interventions? Are the statues we'd like to discuss? Are the statues we'd like to add to the memorial, the public art landscape of Manchester? So we'll be discussing all of those issues, but we'll also be discussing this as a global phenomenon, because over the past 18, 20 months, statues have been removed, either removed by cities or toppled across the world, in the United States, in France, in Belgium, in New Zealand, in Canada, in South Africa, across the Caribbean, as well as in America, where statues, dozens of statues of slave traders, slave owners, Confederate generals, even Thomas Jefferson's statue has been removed. So there's been this incredible moment when these objects on the street that we've tended to kind of walk by and not take much notice of have suddenly been thrust to the centre of important debates that are global debates about our history, what we remember and what we haven't remembered.
And without giving too much away, how necessary do you personally think that it is for these removal of statues?
I think each statue needs to be understood as a separate case. And I think when you do that, what you realise is they're much more complicated objects than we think. And I always thought it was perfect that the statue that was toppled last year was Edward Colston, because it's a perfect example of statues not being what they say they were. Colston died in 1721. The statue was erected in 1895, 170 years, I should say, after his death. It was erected for reasons that are really obscure, to do with an old elite of merchant families worrying about their position in a city that was becoming an industrial city. Nothing to do with slavery, nothing to do with the 19th century. They knew Colston was 17th century, I should say. They knew Colston was a slave trader, they just didn't care. They were just trying to create a civic saint for their own power base, for their own reasons. That statue said nothing about Colston's real life. It said nothing about the 19,000 people he was complicit in killing, or the 84,000 people he was complicit in enslaving. So it was silent about much of that history, and the reasons it was erected are so strange and so disconnected from the history it claims to represent, that it's a perfect example of statues are very strange objects.
That's really interesting. I'm sure people can hear a lot more about that at the event later on. Another question that we've got is, what can the education sector in general be doing more of to be more inclusive or aware of Black history?
Well, I think we're at a moment of change. I think, last year people were saying, is this a moment or is it a movement? So I think it's better understood as part of a process. I think there has been a shift in consciousness that was supercharged last year. Now, if you only listen to what's happening in Parliament, what's coming over the mouths of politicians and what's on the pages of tabloids, you would get a completely different picture. You would think that this country is going through a backlash, that this country is involved in a culture war, that we're about to rip each other apart. If you talk to what's happening in companies and corporations and universities and schools and charities, the discussions taking place within those institutions from the bottom up, not led by politicians, you get a completely different picture of this country, because what's happening in those institutions and thousands of institutions are real conversations, overdue conversations about race, diversity, inclusion, about the way in which structures and cultures and practices can exclude people unwittingly, unintentionally. And they're often being led by younger people, by students in universities, by younger employees in companies. And these conversations are leading to change, to real change, often championed by people in positions of power in those companies. There's an example in the City of London. There's a process, a program called 10,000 Black Interns, which is an attempt to put huge amounts of resources, human resources, but also finance resources, into a project to actually just change the dial on diversity and the financial services. And that's an incredible intervention. These things are happening. You would never get that impression if you listen to politicians.
So another question as well is that you recently contributed to the republication of the interesting narrative of the life of Iloda Equiano, which is regarded as the most significant autobiographical account of slavery to emerge from Britain. So what drew you to this in particular?
Well, it's a book I read as a student, and it just seemed very different to everything that I'd read about slavery, because suddenly here was the voice of someone who'd known slavery. And Equiano, in some ways, as an historian, I love Equiano because he's just so complicated. And history is just really difficult, and it's never simple. And people are never one thing or all the other. Equiano is a really complicated figure. The motivations for writing that book are complex, personal, but also political. The things he says and the things he doesn't say in that book are really complicated. So I like it because it's a very significant book. I like it because I like Equiano, and you can get to know a man who died 200 years ago through the pages of that book. But I also like it because I think it's a great historical text, because it's about the complexity and the nuance of history, and that people are never what you want them to be. They're always much more complicated.
And finally, personally for you, you're always very busy. I know you've been running around all day today as well. What kind of things are you working on at the moment?
We're making a series for the BBC, which is about unity and disunity in Britain. It's about the four nations, but it's also about class, about the dominance of London, about the left behind towns. So we're starting work on that next year. And next month I have a children's book for Key Stage 2, which is coming out, which is another new version of a book I wrote in 2016 called Black and British. So that's a heavily illustrated version for younger kids, because the book that changed my life, Peter Fry's Staying Power I read when I was 16. If there had been a version available when I was 12, it would have been wonderful.
Yeah.
So it's to try to create the book that I didn't have when I was at school.
Well, that's brilliant. I don't know where you find all the time. So thank you very much for joining us, David.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be back in Manchester.